September 3rd, 1945. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The mess hall fell silent as Helga Schneider lifted the small yellow square from her breakfast tray and held it up to the morning light streaming through the windows. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined what American guards had casually placed beside her toast. Real butter. Not the grey synthetic fat that had passed for butter in Germany since 1942. Not the sawdust-mixed margarine substitute that had become standard in the final year of the war. Not even the watered-down ersatz spreads that German housewives had learned to make from whatever they could find. This was actual butter, golden and pure, with tiny beads of moisture still visible on its surface. 47 German women, prisoners of war who had served in Wehrmacht auxiliary units, watched as Helga slowly brought the butter to her nose and inhaled. The scent hit her like a physical blow. Rich, creamy, impossibly real. It was the smell of peacetime Germany, of childhood birthdays, of Christmas mornings before the war consumed everything. Her eyes filled with tears that she couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. Around her, other women were lifting their own portions of butter, some pressing it against their cheeks, others simply staring at it in disbelief. Oberhelferinnen. Maria Weber, who had coordinated communications at Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin, broke down completely. She sat at the long wooden table, holding the butter in both hands like a precious jewel, sobbing without shame. 4 years. 4 years since she had tasted real butter. 4 years since any German civilian had seen such abundance. 4 years of deprivation, of making do, of convincing themselves that the ersatz substitutes were good enough. And here, in an American prison camp served to enemy prisoners as if it were nothing special, was butter so real it seemed like a dream. What the American guards couldn't understand as they watched the German women weep over their breakfast was that they were witnessing the collapse of everything these women had believed about their homeland's strength and their enemies' weakness. Nazi propaganda had told them America was soft, decadent, collapsing under the weight of racial mixing and democratic chaos. Yet here was butter, real butter, served to prisoners in quantities that suggested it wasn't even rationed. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The journey to this moment of revelation had begun 3 months earlier with Germany's surrender. Approximately 1,200 German women who had served in Wehrmacht auxiliary positions, primarily in communications, administration, and logistics roles, found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Unlike the hundreds of thousands of male POWs who filled camps across America, these women represented something the US military hadn't fully anticipated. Female enemy combatants who weren't quite combatants but had served the Wehrmacht nonetheless. The initial processing at the port of New York in June 1945 provided the first hints of what awaited them. Helga Schneider, who had operated radio equipment in occupied France, kept a diary that American censors allowed her to maintain. Her entry from June 12, 1945, captured the confusion. They gave us cheese for lunch. Real cheese, not the wooden blocks we'd been eating that someone claimed were cheese. I asked the guard if this was special treatment because we were women. He looked at me strangely and said this was normal prisoner rations. Normal. The word kept echoing in my mind. If this was normal for prisoners, what did American civilians eat? The transport trains that carried German women POWs from East Coast ports to camps in the South provided intensive education in American abundance. Unlike the cattle cars that had moved prisoners across Europe, these were passenger coaches with padded seats and functioning restrooms, but it was the food service that shattered their first assumptions. At a stop in Virginia, Red Cross volunteers distributed sandwiches to the prisoners. Maria Weber recorded in a letter that somehow survived censorship. The sandwiches contained more meat than I had seen in a month in Germany. Real ham, thick slices with lettuce and tomatoes. The American woman handing them out apologized that they weren't fresh, that they had been made that morning and might be a bit dry. Dry. She apologized for sandwiches that were better than anything we'd eaten in years. The camps designated for German women POWs were smaller than the massive compounds holding male prisoners. Camp Clinton in Mississippi, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and Camp Butner in North Carolina each housed between 50 and 300 women. The facilities had been hastily adapted from other uses, but they provided something remarkable by German standards: individual beds with actual mattresses, running hot water, and electric lights that didn't flicker or fail. But it was the food service that delivered the deepest psychological impact. The first full meal at Camp Clinton, served on the evening of August 15, 1945, became legendary among the German women held there. The menu, preserved in camp records, listed roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, dinner rolls with butter, apple pie with ice cream, and coffee with real sugar and cream available. Greta Hoffmann, who had served as a Wehrmacht secretary in Norway, described that first dinner in an interview conducted in 1987. "We thought it was a mistake. We thought they had confused us with American personnel and served us the wrong meal. The portions were enormous, an entire chicken leg for each prisoner, butter served in small individual portions on each tray, real coffee, not the acorn substitute we'd been drinking." When I asked the guard if this was correct, he seemed puzzled by the question. He said it was standard Tuesday dinner, not a holiday, not a special occasion, just Tuesday. The butter, specifically, became an obsession among the German women POWs. Unlike male prisoners who focused on quantities of food in general, the women, many of whom had been responsible for household management before the war, understood exactly what real butter represented. It wasn't just a dairy product. It was an indicator of agricultural surplus, of industrial capacity to process and refrigerate, of transportation systems that could move perishables without spoilage, of an economy so abundant that even prisoners could have real butter. Ilse Brandt, a Luftwaffe auxiliary who had tracked aircraft movements, began calculating the implications. In Germany, butter production had collapsed from 750,000 tons in 1938 to barely 200,000 tons in 1944. By 1945, real butter had essentially vanished from civilian consumption. The monthly ration, when available, was 50 grams per person, roughly 2 tablespoons. Most German civilians hadn't seen real butter since 1942. The American butter ration, by contrast, was 4 ounces per person per week for civilians, despite wartime restrictions. In POW camps, butter appeared at virtually every meal. Breakfast included butter portions of approximately 1 tablespoon. Lunch often featured butter on rolls or bread. Dinner provided butter for vegetables or bread. The weekly consumption by German women POWs exceeded what German civilians received in 6 months. The mathematics were inescapable and devastating to German morale. If America could provide real butter to enemy prisoners while fighting a global war on 2 fronts, what did that say about German propaganda claims of American weakness? If America could afford to serve butter casually while German soldiers had subsisted on margarine and ersatz spreads, what did that say about the Reich's vaunted efficiency? The butter became a catalyst for deeper examinations of everything the Nazi regime had told them. The camp at Clinton established a small library where German women could read American newspapers and magazines. Unlike the censored German press they had known, these publications openly criticized government policies, debated military strategies, and showed photographs that revealed both American successes and failures. Maria Weber spent hours in the library, reading back issues of Life magazine from 1944 and 1945. What she found astounded her. Advertisements showing abundant food in American stores, photographs of well-stocked supermarkets, articles discussing how Americans were managing butter shortages by using margarine a few times per week. The American conception of shortage bore no relationship to German reality. Americans complained about having slightly less butter, while Germans had none. The contrast extended beyond butter to every aspect of daily life. The German women POWs at Camp Clinton discovered that their prison camp conditions exceeded what most German civilians experienced in freedom. The barracks had central heating that actually worked. The showers provided hot water reliably. The toilets functioned properly and included toilet paper, a luxury that had vanished from Germany by 1944. The medical clinic had real medicines, not the substitute compounds German civilians had learned to endure. Helga Schneider injured her ankle during a volleyball game in October 1945. The camp doctor examined it, took X-rays using equipment that impressed her with its modernity, and prescribed pain medication. Real pain medication, not the aspirin substitutes that German civilians had been making from willow bark. The doctor apologized that she would need to stay off her feet for a week. She nearly laughed at the apology. In Germany, injured workers were expected to continue regardless of pain. Here, a prisoner received better medical care than German soldiers had received in field hospitals. The psychological transformation accelerated as winter approached. The camp distributed winter clothing in November: heavy coats, wool sweaters, insulated boots, gloves and scarves. The quality exceeded what Wehrmacht personnel had received. More disturbing to their understanding of German superiority, the clothing was clearly mass-produced to standardized sizes, yet fit remarkably well. American industrial capacity could produce prisoner clothing better than German industry could produce military uniforms. Christmas 1945 delivered the final devastating blow to German assumptions about American society. The women POWs at Camp Clinton expected nothing. Christmas in Germany had been stripped of celebration by 1944. Food was scarce, gifts were impossible, and the holiday had become another day of deprivation. Instead, on Christmas morning, American church groups and local civilians arrived with gifts for the prisoners. The scene that unfolded would have been unthinkable in Nazi Germany. Local Mississippi families, many with sons who had fought against Germany, brought homemade cookies, candy, small gifts, and Christmas cards to enemy prisoners. The Methodist church choir from nearby Clinton sang carols in English and in carefully practiced German. The Rotary Club provided a Christmas dinner that included turkey, ham, multiple side dishes, and pies made by local women. Greta Hoffman received a package from a local family she had never met. Inside were hand-knit socks, a bar of real soap, chocolate, and a Christmas card with a handwritten message. From the Wilson family to our German guest. May you return home soon to your family. Merry Christmas. She sat on her bunk holding the card, crying at the cognitive dissonance. The enemy showed more Christian charity than her own government ever had. The Christmas feast itself became another lesson in American abundance. The turkey was prepared by professional cooks from the base. The portions were generous to the point of wasteful by German standards. Multiple desserts were offered. Coffee flowed freely with real cream and sugar, and on every table, served as if it were nothing special, was butter. Real butter, yellow and golden and impossibly abundant. Maria Weber later testified to American military researchers studying POW psychology. Christmas 1945 was when we understood completely that everything we had been told was a lie. Not propaganda exaggeration, but fundamental lies. We had been told America was weak, collapsing, unable to feed its people, yet here they were, feeding us better than German generals ate, giving us gifts when their own civilians faced rationing, showing us kindness that Nazi ideology said was impossible between races and nations. The butter on Christmas tables wasn't just food, it was proof that our entire worldview was wrong. The butter portions on Christmas Day were doubled, 2 tablespoons per prisoner, served with fresh-baked rolls that filled the mess hall with the smell of yeast and warmth. Some German women couldn't eat it immediately. They wrapped it carefully in napkins, taking it back to their barracks to savor later to prove to themselves it was real. Others spread it thickly on bread and ate slowly, with tears running down their faces, tasting childhood and peacetime and everything the war had stolen. By January 1946, preparations for repatriation began. The German women, POWs, would return to a destroyed homeland, to cities in ruins, to families scattered and broken. American authorities offered educational programs to prepare them for reconstruction, technical training in office skills, language classes, discussions of democratic governance. But the most powerful education had been unintentional, the simple daily experience of American abundance. The butter had taught them more than any formal program could. It had shown them that a democratic society, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency that Nazi propaganda had mocked, could produce abundance that totalitarian control never achieved. It had demonstrated that free farmers working for profit created more than enslaved peoples working under command. It had proved that a multiracial, multi-ethnic society could organize logistics that exceeded German efficiency. Ilse Brandt organized informal discussion groups among the German women POWs in early 1946. They met in the camp library, talking through their experiences, trying to process what they had learned. The conversations, monitored but not suppressed by American authorities, revealed systematic ideological collapse. Women who had arrived believing in German superiority, in Nazi racial theories, in the righteousness of their cause, now questioned everything. "How did we not know?" Brandt asked during one session in February 1946. "How did we believe that America was weak when they could afford real butter for prisoners? How did we think democratic chaos would fail when it produced abundance we never imagined? Every meal here has been an argument against everything we were taught. Every portion of butter was proof that we were on the wrong side." The discussions sometimes became heated as women processed their disillusionment differently. Some clung to remnants of Nazi ideology, arguing that American abundance was temporary, unsustainable, achieved through exploitation. But the evidence overwhelmed these arguments. The American guards and administrators they interacted with daily showed no signs of being oppressed. The civilian volunteers who brought Christmas gifts weren't coerced. The butter kept coming, meal after meal, proof of systematic abundance rather than temporary show. Helga Schneider's diary entries from February 1946 captured the transformation. "Today, I received a letter from my mother in Hamburg. She wrote that they haven't had butter in over a year. The ration cards promise it, but there is none to distribute. She asked me to save my portions and bring them home somehow, not understanding that butter would spoil on the month-long journey. I wrote back trying to describe what I've learned here, that the problem wasn't shortages, wasn't the blockade, wasn't the bombing. The problem was the system itself. Germany could have fed its people if we hadn't been trying to conquer the world. America fed the world while fighting a war because their system created rather than destroyed." The camp at Clinton established a small bakery where German women could learn American baking techniques. The classes were ostensibly vocational training for their return home, but they became something more profound. American instructors taught recipes that assumed butter was available, that called for cups of it rather than teaspoons. The German women, who had learned to bake with substitutes and workarounds, discovered that American home baking used more butter in one cake than German families had received in months. The instructors' casual attitude toward butter was perhaps most revealing. When Greta Hoffmann carefully scraped every bit of butter from a measuring cup, the American teacher laughed kindly and said not to worry. There was plenty more. Plenty more. The phrase echoed in Hoffmann's mind for days. In Germany, nothing was plentiful. Everything was rationed, controlled, carefully measured. The casual abundance of American life challenged everything Nazi economics had taught. March 1946 brought warmer weather and outdoor activities. The camp at Clinton had volleyball courts, a small garden area where prisoners could grow flowers, and a recreation field. American authorities encouraged exercise and outdoor activity. The German women discovered that their prison camp offered more recreational opportunities than most German civilians had enjoyed even before the war. The Nazi regime had controlled leisure time, regimented recreation, turned everything into duty. Here, prisoners had actual free time to spend as they wished. The food service remained consistently abundant. Breakfast always included butter. Lunch provided it with bread or rolls. Dinner featured it in multiple forms: spread, melted on vegetables, baked into foods. The monotony of abundance became its own lesson. This wasn't special treatment or propaganda display. This was normal American consumption, even for prisoners, even during wartime recovery. In April 1946, repatriation began. The German women POWs boarded ships at New Orleans bound for Hamburg and Bremen. American authorities provided each woman with a care package for the journey and for arrival in Germany: canned goods, dried milk, coffee, soap and clothing. No butter, as it would spoil during the voyage, but condensed milk and other preserved foods that would help them survive the first difficult months. The return voyage provided time for reflection. Helga Schneider stood at the ship's rail watching the American coast disappear and wrote in her diary, "I came to America as a prisoner expecting harsh treatment and deprivation. I received better food, better housing, better medical care than I had known in Germany even before the war. I leave understanding that we lost not just militarily, but philosophically. A system that can provide butter to enemy prisoners is stronger than one that can't feed its own people. I weep not for Germany's defeat, but for the years wasted believing in lies." The arrival in Hamburg in May 1946 provided stark contrast to the America they had left. The city was ruins. Buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed, civilians gaunt and desperate. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. The British occupation forces provided basic rations, but there was no butter, no abundance, no casual plenty. The returnees from America found themselves as foreigners in their own land, carrying knowledge of a different world. Maria Weber returned to her family in Munich to find them subsisting on 700 calories daily. The rations provided by American occupation forces were better than anything available from German sources, but they were survival rations, nothing more. When Weber described the butter at Camp Clinton, her mother thought she was exaggerating or had been deceived by American propaganda. Only when other returnees confirmed the same stories did German civilians begin to believe. The butter became a reference point among returnees. When Germans complained about occupation rations, women who had been in American camps would mention the butter portions at Clinton or Ruston or Butner. When Nazi true believers claimed Germany would have won with more time, the returnees would describe the casual abundance they had witnessed. The butter was proof, unarguable evidence of American superiority in the dimension that mattered most: the ability to feed people. Hilsebrandt settled in Frankfurt and became involved in women's groups working on reconstruction. She gave talks about her experiences as a POW, emphasizing the lessons learned. "We must understand why we lost," she would say. "It wasn't just military defeat. It was systematic failure of our entire approach to society. The Americans could provide butter to prisoners because their system created abundance. We couldn't feed our own people because our system consumed everything for war. The butter was the proof we couldn't deny." Some returnees faced criticism from Germans who had suffered through the war years at home. How dare they speak well of the enemy? How dare they describe abundance while German civilians starved? But the returnees persisted in sharing what they had learned. Germany needed to understand, they argued, that the Nazi path had led only to destruction. The butter was proof that another way was possible. Greta Hoffmann's story exemplified the transformation. She had believed in National Socialism, had volunteered for Wehrmacht service, had accepted Nazi propaganda about German superiority. The butter at Camp Clinton began her education, but it continued through every interaction with American abundance. By the time she returned to Germany, she had become an advocate for democracy and cooperation with the occupying powers. In a letter to the U.S. Army Historical Division in 1947, Hoffmann wrote, "You asked what most changed our perspectives during captivity. Everyone mentions the butter, not because it was exceptional, but because it was ordinary. You served it to prisoners as if it were nothing special. That casual abundance revealed everything. Germany had told us you were weak, decadent, failing. The butter proved you were strong, organized, successful. Every meal was an education in what we had failed to understand about democracy and freedom. The statistical evidence supported the returnees' testimonies. American butter production during World War II had actually increased from wartime lows, reaching £1.3 billion in 1945. This production occurred while America was supplying butter to Allied nations through Lend-Lease programs, feeding millions of troops overseas, and yes, providing real butter to POW camps. The abundance wasn't illusion or propaganda, it was documented fact. German butter production statistics told the opposite story. From 750,000 tons in 1938, production had collapsed to 200,000 tons in 1944 and continued falling in 1945. The Nazi economic system, for all its claims of efficiency, had failed to feed its people even before the final collapse. The comparison was devastating to anyone who had believed German propaganda. The women who had been POWs in America became, almost accidentally, missionaries for democratic capitalism. They hadn't intended this role. They had simply experienced abundance and sought to explain what they had learned. But their testimonies influenced German reconstruction more than official programs could. These were not American propagandists, but German women who had lived through both systems and could compare them honestly. By 1948, American butter began appearing in German stores as Marshall Plan aid and economic recovery took hold. For the women who had been POWs in America, this arrival of butter carried profound symbolic meaning. Helga Schneider, now working for the American Occupation Administration in Munich, wrote in her diary, "Today I bought butter in a German store. Real butter, golden and pure, just like at Camp Clinton. I stood in the store holding it and remembered that September morning when I first tasted it as a prisoner. I wept then from the shock of abundance. I weep now from gratitude that this abundance might be possible here, that Germany might learn to create rather than conquer." The Marshall Plan's shipment of dairy products to Germany included technical assistance for butter production. American dairy experts worked with German farmers to rebuild herds, restore processing facilities, and establish distribution networks. Some of these experts heard stories about the German women POWs who had been so affected by butter in American camps. They understood, perhaps better than military officials, that food security was the foundation of political stability. Maria Weber became an interpreter for the Marshall Plan in Berlin. She translated not just words but concepts, explaining to German officials how American agricultural abundance was achieved through free markets, mechanization, and farmer independence. When German bureaucrats proposed central planning for dairy production, Weber would describe the casual plenty at Camp Clinton and ask how German planning could match American results. Often, the comparison was enough to change minds. The influence of these returning women extended to their families and communities. Their children grew up hearing about the butter at Camp Clinton. Their neighbors learned that democratic systems could produce abundance. The stories spread through German society, contributing to the acceptance of Western-style democracy in what would become West Germany. By 1950, the butter shortage in West Germany had largely ended. Rationing was eliminated. Stores carried multiple varieties. German butter production had recovered to pre-war levels. The women who had wept over butter portions at Camp Clinton could now buy butter freely in their homeland. The transformation from wartime deprivation to peacetime abundance vindicated everything they had learned in American captivity. Greta Hoffmann, interviewed in 1955 about her experiences, reflected on the journey from despair to hope. "When I first tasted that butter in Mississippi, I wept because it meant everything I believed was wrong. When I returned to Germany and found only ruins and starvation, I wept from despair. Now, buying butter in a Munich shop, I weep from joy that we learned the right lessons. The butter was never just about food. It was about systems, about freedom, about what societies can achieve when they create rather than destroy. The generation of German women who experienced American POW camps became unexpected advocates for the Atlantic Alliance. They had seen firsthand that American abundance wasn't propaganda but reality. They had experienced democratic generosity toward enemies. They understood that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. Their influence on post-war German society, though difficult to quantify, was profound. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, a small reunion gathered in Munich. 12 surviving women who had been held at Camp Clinton came together to share memories. They were elderly now, grandmothers who had lived through Germany's remarkable recovery. The organizers, understanding the symbolism, served real butter at the dinner. Several women cried at seeing those familiar yellow squares on their plates, remembering that September morning 40 years earlier, when butter had shattered their worldview. Helga Schneider spoke at the reunion dinner. Her remarks, preserved in a local newspaper account, captured the essence of what that butter had meant. We came to America as prisoners, believers, in a failed ideology, convinced of our own superiority. Real butter, served casually by guards who thought nothing of it, began our education. Every meal, every portion of butter, every instance of abundance we didn't deserve, taught us that we had been wrong, not just militarily defeated, but philosophically mistaken. The butter was proof we couldn't deny. 40 years later, I remain grateful for that education, bought at the cost of tears and humiliation, but worth every moment. Germany became great, not through conquest, but through learning to create abundance like the America we discovered in Mississippi. The returnees had brought home more than memories. They carried knowledge that abundance was possible, that democratic systems could produce prosperity, that enemies could become friends. The butter at Camp Clinton had been their first lesson in these truths, but the lesson had continued through every interaction with American plenty. They had become witnesses to a different way of organizing society, one that created rather than destroyed, one that fed even prisoners with abundance. By the 21st century, the story of German women POWs weeping over butter had largely faded from historical memory. It wasn't dramatic like battles or strategic like political decisions, but for the women who lived it, the experience had been transformative. They had discovered through the simple medium of dairy products that everything they had believed was wrong. The butter was proof, undeniable and unarguable, of American superiority in the dimension that ultimately mattered most, the ability to create abundance. The lessons learned at American mess halls in 1945 and 1946 influenced German development for decades. West Germany embraced market economics, partially because returning POWs, both male and female, had witnessed American abundance firsthand. They had seen that democratic capitalism, for all its apparent chaos, produced results that central planning never achieved. The butter was their evidence, their proof, their justification for rebuilding Germany along Western lines. Ilse Brandt's final interview before her death in 1992 returned to the theme that had defined her generation's experience. People ask what convinced us to abandon Nazi ideology. The answer isn't complex philosophy or political argument. It was butter, real butter, served to prisoners as if it were nothing special. That casual abundance proved everything we had believed was wrong. We wept when we first tasted it because we understood in that moment that our entire worldview had collapsed. The butter was the proof we couldn't deny, the evidence that our enemies were stronger, not because they were more brutal, but because they were more free. Every German who ate American butter learned this lesson. Some learned it as prisoners, others learned it during Reconstruction, but the lesson was the same. Freedom creates abundance, tyranny creates scarcity. The butter proved it. The story of German women POWs weeping over butter captures a profound historical truth. Wars are won not just through military force but through systematic superiority in every dimension. American abundance, symbolized by casual butter portions served to enemy prisoners, demonstrated that democratic capitalism could outproduce totalitarian control. The women who experienced this abundance became witnesses to this truth, carrying it home to help rebuild Germany along lines that would ensure the butter and everything it represented would never be denied to German people again. September 3rd, 1945. Helga Schneider lifted that small yellow square of butter and wept for everything she had lost, her youth, her beliefs, her certainty. But in that moment of breakdown, she gained something more valuable: knowledge that abundance was possible, that systems mattered, that the casual plenty represented by real butter was achievable through freedom rather than conquest. The tears that fell on her breakfast tray that morning watered seeds of understanding that would bloom into a new Germany, one that learned to create rather than conquer, one that discovered that butter mattered more than bullets in building a society worth living in. The women who wept over butter in American prison camps became missionaries of abundance, carrying home the proof that democratic freedom could achieve what totalitarian control never would. Enough butter for everyone served as if it were nothing special, because in America it wasn't.